I'm Katrin Preller. I am researching psychedelics and have been doing so for about 8 years now. I started off studying psychology and then did my PhD mostly in addiction medicine before I then changed the subject and started to do research with psychedelics. And that has led me to University of Zurich, University College London, as well as Yale University. And now I'm leading a group which is studying psychedelics in healthy human participants, as well as doing some clinical studies.
Awesome. Well, for listeners out there who are familiar, psychedelics have gained a lot of interest lately in the realm of mental health and psychiatry as possible a new method of treatment for different mental illnesses. So it's an area that's very interesting to me and to a lot of my peers, but it's also, I think, culturally interesting because at least in the United States, the history and interaction between different substances and the legal structure have sort of led to different preconceptions or different ideas about different substances. And it's interesting to think about these substances in particular, like psilocybin and LSD, and looking at them now through a possibly therapeutic lens. So that's what I was hoping for us to dive into today. I've already kind of hinted into it, but could you start by talking about what are psychedelics? And when we're talking about psychedelics, what are some of the ones that you're maybe most familiar with from a research perspective?
Yeah. Most of my work focuses on the effects of LSD and psilocybin on the human brain. We've also done a few studies with GHB or MDMA and other related substances, but yeah, most of my work is on LSD and psilocybin. And what we've been doing there is, on the one hand, in healthy participants, looking at the effects of these substances in the brain and onto behavior. And on the other hand, more recently also started to look at these substances as therapeutics and test the efficacy, so the beneficial, potential beneficial effects in clinical populations such as depression and alcohol use disorder.
Mm, very cool. So depression and alcohol use disorder, both of those, I think, are areas where people are kind of desperate for new options or things that, kind of additional methods or mechanisms of action for people that maybe don't have a response to something like an SSRI and depression. And this might offer a different mechanism of action. Would you be able to talk about kind of how psychedelics work?
Yeah. So when we talk about psychedelics or classical serotonergic psychedelics, at least, there seems to be one primary mechanism of action, and that is the serotonin 2A receptor. So basically, when the substance enters the brain, it stimulates this specific receptor, which then leads to the neurons, so the cell in the brain, communicating differently with other cells in the brain. And what we've seen in our studies, especially with healthy participants, is that the communication pattern changes in a way that, first of all, the thalamus, which is a region that usually filters the information that we get from either within ourselves or our environment to the cortex, that this particular region is not able to filter the information as it usually does. So that means that it sends more information to specific areas in the cortex, and we've seen that it is more strongly connected, especially to areas which are responsible for processing sensory information, so what we see and hear and feel in our environment. And what happens after that is that we've seen that these sensory brain regions which process the sensory input are very strongly connected with each other under the influence of LSD as well as psilocybin. But at the same time, other brain regions are so-called associative brain regions, which we usually use to integrate all this sensory information. They are loosely connected to the rest of the brain, which basically could mean that we have this heightened sensory state that a lot of people experience under the influence of a psychedelic. But the way we put this information together to make a coherent picture, that seems to be different under the influence of a psychedelic. And on the one hand, this could maybe explain why we have, for example, these visual illusions under the influence. But it could also explain why some patients report that they are able to look at the world and themselves in a new way, because we kind of put the information we receive together in a different way, in a new way. And that is one of the mechanisms that could indeed be helpful for patients. But talking about the mechanism of action, as you can already see just from this very short description, psychedelics act on many different levels. So we have the receptor, we have potential long-term changes in this receptor structure, we have alterations in how the brain communicates or how the different brain areas communicate with each other, as well as obviously a psychological level where people report about insight into their problems, where they feel socially connected with the rest of the world, which might be super important, especially for patients. So there is a whole variety of things that could eventually lead to a patient feeling better. And at this point in time right now, we don't really know which of these factors is the most contributing one to the clinical efficacy. That is definitely an open question that we are now trying to address in our studies with healthy participants as well as in our patient trials.
Mm. Yeah, and with major depression in particular, it seems like there's sort of increasing evidence about the multifactorial, sort of nature of the disease. And for a long time, it was understood as being, due to quote unquote chemical imbalance or neurotransmitter imbalance. And it seems like the picture's a lot more complex than that for major depressive disorder. And it seems like similarly with psychedelics that there's this change in the 5-HT2A sort of activity, but also maybe the connections in various parts of the brain and whatever sort of psychological effects it has, and sort of gained insight into, whatever the person's, origins of their illness are, that those could all be contributing to this picture as well. I'm in particular, I'm really interested in what role it could have from the sort of opening up or kind of opening up different avenues of communication between different areas of the brain. Because from a brain imaging standpoint, there's quite a bit of evidence around kind of how the brain activity becomes very narrowed in major depressive disorder. And so maybe just kind of returning to our brain's normal kind of multidimensional sort of activity of its circuits, that maybe that's maybe a major component to this, like you were saying. So it'll be very interesting to see kind of what brain imaging pulls out to show really what the effects are from a brain activity standpoint.
Absolutely. So in the trial I was talking about earlier, where we're testing psilocybin for the treatment of depression. So in this trial, we're doing fMRI imaging before and after the psilocybin session. So we hope that by doing that, we will gain some insight into whether psilocybin has some long-term changes in potential pathological brain communication patterns, and see if they are normalized or change in any way after the treatment.
Fantastic. So could you dive in a little bit more about some of the studies out there for some, specific mental illnesses, be it depression or you mentioned alcohol use disorder, or maybe smoking cessation? Just what some of the evidence is out there and kind of what's causing all this excitement?
Yeah. So to maybe answer your later question first is, well, the excitement is, I guess, coming from the fact that we have very little new medication and ways of treatment in psychiatry. So most of the medication that is out there is more or less based on things that we discovered about 50 years ago. And these drugs just don't work for everyone, and they do have side effects, of course, but also there is a certain population which is just not responsive to the treatments we can currently offer. And we've had about 10, almost 20 years where no real new medication has come to the market, which obviously leaves this high unmet need in psychiatry where we need better treatment. And with psychedelics, I mean, we knew already from the 50s and 60s that there might be a signal there, that they might have beneficial effects in different patient populations. But then, of course, after these substances were put in Schedule 1, there was very little research being done on these substances for almost 50 years. And now, as we're kind of revisiting this and trying to do these studies that we knew from back then, that there should be a beneficial effect, there are a couple of studies out there in different disease areas such as addiction, depression, anxiety, and OCD, which show really interesting results, which really kind of confirm what people have already seen in the 50s and 60s. However, obviously, the methodological standards back then were quite different from the ones we have today. And that's why we really need to do these studies again and conduct them rigorously and according to the current standards. And that is kind of what is happening right now. But also, we need to be aware that a lot of these studies that I was talking about so far have been conducted in very few patients. So it's really small studies, and most of them have not had any control condition. And that is obviously not the standard that we need to determine whether these substances are really helpful. So what we need to do now is to conduct larger studies, have them well controlled, to be able to really tell whether we can see a beneficial clinical signal according to modern standards.
Mm. And based on all the things that have been tried, what would you say is the area or perhaps the illness or the use of psychedelics that maybe has been the most impressive, maybe the best controlled study or the largest sample size?
Yeah. So there are two studies which which are studies with a control condition, so randomized control trials in patients with end-of-life anxiety. So this is definitely the clearest evidence so far out there in a pretty large sample size that there is a positive effect of psilocybin. Recently, there was actually just a few days ago, Johns Hopkins published a first randomized control trial in depressed patients, which show really good results as well. This study is still pretty small though. So again, we need kind of larger sample size, but it's a really, really good first step to show that even in a controlled design, we can show that there is a beneficial effect of psilocybin. There are more studies being conducted right now, also in addiction, but what has been published so far is really anxiety and depression in a controlled environment where we do see a really promising signal.
Mm. And it seems like in a lot of these sort of treatment plans, I guess, that would be written about in these studies, or in a lot of the research that groups are doing, there's an important sort of therapeutic aspect, like an interpersonal therapeutic aspect, in addition to the physical substance itself. Could you talk a little bit about kind of how these, are normally given to patients, and sort of what are the different components of maybe a therapeutic environment when these substances are being studied?
Yeah. So what we and most other study sites are doing is that we really put a high emphasis on having a period where we prepare the patients, where we do therapy with them. So that is usually about 4 to 6 sessions where the patient receives therapy, which could be based on cognitive behavioral therapy. It could be more based on psychoanalysis. That is kind of dependent on the study site. And then we have the active session where participants in a placebo control trial receive either psilocybin or or placebo. And then we have another large part which follows after the active dosing session, which is another 4 to 5 to 6 sessions where people integrate the experience they had and where therapy basically continues, and where we try to work with the patient to transfer whatever came up in the session into the real life, to make real use of that. And I think that is incredibly important. The way we look at psychedelic assisted therapy is not that we just give the substance and it's doing their magic and all of a sudden, all problems go away, but it's really a therapeutic process which begins quite a while before participants actually get the active dose. So there are still quite a few open questions around that. So we don't have any empirical data in about trying to understand which kind of therapy works best with the active substance or with the dosing session. So far, basically, usually most people have done either psychoanalytic or cognitive behavioral therapy approaches, but it's not like anyone has ever compared that, or that anyone has ever looked at, are there other measures or other means of doing that? So this is definitely still an open question that we really need to answer in the near future. The other thing that is still kind of unclear so far is how many dosing sessions are necessary. So our studies are conducted with just one dosing session. Most other studies have used repeated dosing, where they usually administer a very low dose first and then a higher dose about 1 or 2 weeks later. But again, all these things are still open questions, and we'll need to find out what works best.
Mm. Yeah, it seems like from what I've read about psychedelics and the way of thinking about these as medications is, some people think about it as a sort of standalone medication, like any other, medication you would take for any other disease. But then it's also been thought of, and I think was in its most original uses several decades ago, thought of as sort of an augmentation for talk therapy. And so the way that you describe it there, it seems like sort of the talk therapy component of the treatment session is really important, and that there's perhaps some mechanism that the psychedelic is doing to make somebody more amenable to talk therapy, and sort of developing sort of greater insight into the nature of their illness or of their psychological sort of thought process, and maybe how they can make different changes.
Absolutely. And I think there's even an additional component to that one, which we're also looking into in our current studies. So some of my work has focused on the social aspects of psychedelics. So how does social behavior and social processing change under the influence of a psychedelic? And we've seen that, for example, participants under the influence of psilocybin show greater empathy, for example, and they show less rejection sensitivity. And these things could also be super interesting within the framework of psychedelic assisted therapy, because that could mean that the participant is able to open up more strongly to the therapist, or it could improve patient-therapist relationships, for example.
Mm.
So these are also aspects which could contribute to the beneficial outcome. And yeah, we're trying to find out more about that in our current studies.
Mm. So that sort of leads me into the next part of this is, there is some hint here that it may be beneficial for anxiety or for depression, and maybe some emerging evidence around different substance use disorders. What questions do you feel like we still need to answer?
So I think the question which is key at the moment is really finding out more about the mechanism of action, or what part of the mechanisms or effects that the psychedelic has are really beneficial for the patient. And I think this will be key, because that might also change the way of how we conduct the therapy that comes with administering the psychedelic. And yeah, as I said, we're kind of making the first steps into this direction, but so far we really don't, we have a lot of hypotheses, but we really don't know anything from the trials that have been conducted so far, because they did not, or not, at least not in great detail, assess these mechanistic effects. So I think that is definitely one of the main questions that we need to target in the near future.
Mm. And just one component of this that I'm especially interested in is around substance use disorders, or around tobacco use or alcohol use. Since we talked a little bit more about perhaps the studies that have more evidence or were better designed around anxiety or depression, could you speak briefly about either for tobacco use or alcohol use or whatever you're more sort of familiar with, and how we think that that psychedelics are contributing to it, whether it be from uh, the direct role on the 5-HT2A receptor, or whether it be related to sort of the neural circuits. Is there any idea kind of what the mechanism might be, particularly for addictions?
Yeah, honestly, we really don't know. So, as you just mentioned, there are so many hypotheses around that,
Mm-hmm.
from the receptor level to the circuit level. Um, there are some hints from animal studies which show that psychedelics may increase neuroplasticity, and what that means is that they might help us, at least for a certain amount of time, to learn faster and to also forget faster. And obviously, this is something that might be super interesting, especially in addiction, where we have these really close associations between drug use and craving or use behavior. So this is a connection that is deeply wired in the brain of someone who suffers from addiction. And if we could loosen this connection, for example, by inducing neuroplasticity, then this could be a potential mechanism. There are others, of course. So we're also looking at how psychedelics may change reward processing. There's little known about this quite yet, but we're trying to look at that in our addicted population that we're studying currently, because while in an addicted brain, the addicted brain reacts very strongly to these drug cues, and the way that these patients process reward is very differently, potentially because they have been perturbing their system with another drug for a long time. And what we know there is, for example, that addicted patients react differently, for example, also to social reward. And we know that social reward is super important, because that is kind of what keeps us, together as a society, but also which kind of keeps us at a family level, for example. And I've been working with addicted patients way back during my PhD. And what you hear repeatedly there is like, I lost all my friends, or parents who say like, well, I don't understand my child anymore, I don't have access to my child anymore. There's a lot of social withdrawal, and one of the reasons for that is potentially because social interaction just doesn't feel as rewarding to these patients anymore. And now combining this with the research that I just mentioned, that we could potentially increase the feeling of social connectedness with psychedelics, we could hope that there is a shift towards, having just the drug being the main reward, to moving back to a social reward, for example. And that could be another mechanism that might be especially interesting when we're talking about addicted patients.
That's really interesting, because I think for the is there an audio issue that you're hearing? I'm hearing it sort of cut in and out. Let me see. Okay, can you hear me?
I can.
Okay. Yeah, that's very interesting what you're saying around learning, because I think for a normal audience member, everyone thinks about learning as a very sort of positive thing, something that grows your brain and always makes it better. But thinking through the lens of addiction and through conditioning, and how, just like rats in a cage that step on a lever and are, fed food, it's similar, these sort of learned behaviors that happen for the development of many addictions. And so if we could increase the neuroplasticity and increase somebody's ability to learn something new, a different lever to pull to feel good or to feel more energized, or to feel more focused, and then also to have a little bit more plasticity in the way of forgetting old learned behaviors, that would be something that would be very intriguing for treatment of these disorders.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think that is really a super interesting hypothesis. Unfortunately, the increased neuroplasticity so far has only been shown in animals, and we still need to translate that into humans. And I really hope that this study will happen soon, because it could also have implications again for how we conduct the therapy. Because just inducing neuroplasticity alone doesn't necessarily do much, right? But you also
Mm-hmm.
need to kind of guide the learning or forgetting into the right way, which then would again be the task that the therapy has to complete. And so if we indeed see increased neuroplasticity also in humans, then that could again have implications for how exactly we conduct the therapy.
Mm. Very interesting. So I think one component of this that I always come across whenever I speak with somebody about this field of psychedelics is that for a lot of people, it seems, well, hey, you're taking somebody that was addicted to one street drug and you're giving them another street drug like mushrooms or like LSD. And so I'd be curious what you would say to somebody thinking about it through that realm, specifically around kind of what is our current understanding about these substances, and perhaps their safety profile and their addictive nature or lack thereof, and how that's been considered as part of sort of the risk profile when analyzing this as a possible treatment.
Yeah, so I think with psychedelics, there are two major differences to other, well, street drugs or alcohol or tobacco as well. And the first thing is that we know that they are not addictive, not on a physiological or a psychological level. So there are no people who would, just do psilocybin every day. That is, that's, I don't think that anyone really wants to do that. But even if they would, our brain, what happens after or during the trip is that we internalize the receptors in the brain, the serotonin 2A receptors. So basically, if you try to use the substance like right the day after, you basically have no effect. So our brain basically protects us from binge using psychedelics. So there is really no addictive effect. The other thing is that it is really hard to overdose on psychedelics. And now, I don't want to recommend anyone taking heroic doses of psychedelics. That's definitely not a good idea, and people will probably have a terrible time. But the difference to other drugs like alcohol or heroin or cocaine is that it's really a lot less likely that it will kill you. And that is a huge difference, right? So that being said, that obviously doesn't mean that psychedelics are for everyone and that it's just completely safe. So we think that there are two things where the safety profile, what the safety profile depends on, and in the psychedelic space, people usually call that set and setting, and what that means is first the set, that means what the patient or participant brings to the study, and the other one is the setting, so where the environment where the drug is taken. And when we're talking about the participant themselves, so first of all, we exclude everyone who has a tendency for psychotic disorders or even first degree relatives with the psychotic disorders, because at this point we cannot exclude that for someone who already tends into this direction, that it might not trigger a psychotic episode. So everything schizophrenia related is excluded from our studies, just to be on the safe side. And the other big exclusion criterion is people with cardiovascular problems, because these substances increase blood pressure, they increase pulse. So for everyone who has issues with that, they definitely should not take a psychedelic. Yeah, and then of course it also depends on, you know, which kind of mood and state the participants comes to us. Like if you just, you know, if you for whatever reason have encountered something terrible on the way to the study site, like you've seen an accident or anything like that, or you just split up with your partner, those are probably not the states you want to be in when taking a psychedelic, because you need to be, and that kind of brings me to the second part, the setting. You need to be calm, and you need to be calm in also in a trustful and calming environment. And that obviously, when we do these studies, that is obviously very different from, let's say, taking a psychedelic on a festival or something like that, because in our setting we try to create a really nice and relaxing atmosphere with, you know, people who are knowledgeable, who provide psychological and medical supervision, and who have the chance to establish a trustful relationship with our participant before we administer the substance.
Mm. So the set and setting are very important components of the effect of the substance itself. Um, and so thinking about, you know, kind of looking ahead and the different research that either you and your team are doing or that you're aware of at different centers, is there anything that's kind of, you know, on the forefront or on the cusp that you're particularly excited about, or sort of a theory that's being looked into that seems very interesting to you?
Um, so I think, so right now there's really a lot of effort put into the clinical studies, and I think
Mm.
that is great, because that will really probably advance treatments in psychiatry for a lot of patients who need novel medication, novel mechanisms of action. So I think that is really something that is going on basically across, or almost across the whole world by now. So a lot of, you know, countries or study sites in different countries have gotten permission to study the effects of psychedelics in patients. And I think that is incredibly exciting, because that will tell us within the next few years whether we can actually use these substances as medication, and that is absolutely exciting. And then, of course, there are other studies going on in different labs, where we're more looking at kind of basic science. What exactly do these substances do in the brain, and what effects do they have in healthy participants? And I think that is also super exciting, because it really tells us more about the neuropharmacology of the brain. So what exactly is the serotonin 2A receptor doing in the brain? And I think there are a lot of interesting things to discover, which may not necessarily influence treatment with psychedelics, but it might lead to new knowledge about how the brain works, and therefore also provide a new path and a scientific roadmap to develop new medication that might not necessarily have to be a psychedelic.
Mm. Well, fantastic. I really look forward to seeing, you know, what continues to come out, because I think it's really hopeful to be able to just have more options for patients to help them to feel better. So something that I like to do to finish off a lot of my episodes is to ask the person I'm speaking with about, you know, what they find in their life as being something that that they're doing for their brain health, whether it be you know, food, diet, exercise, or something kind of unexpected. If there is anything like that you do for your own brain health that people might be interested in.
Um, I think I probably could do a lot more, but
Mm-hmm.
no, there are some things that I really enjoy, and I think that definitely help me to you know, stay calm, even though, you know, sometimes the world seems to go crazy.
Mm-hmm.
And this is really just, you know, taking a few minutes every day, just, you know, for myself, and really doing something that I absolutely enjoy. And whether, you know, that might change from day to day, whether, it's like reading or playing the guitar or whatever, but, just something that I feel like I'm really just doing for myself, and I really enjoy doing that at this particular moment in time. And I think, even if it's just for a few minutes, I think that really helps me to, sometimes put things into perspective.
Certainly. I've been thinking about it. I was wondering uh, what that's called from a research perspective, but there's some papers that I read about that, about the importance of essentially idle time in the ability to form new ideas, new thoughts, and sort of consolidate also kind of previous thoughts and memories. And I just recently had a day where I was just at home and working on things all day. I was just at home, and I felt kind of stuck in, like, I didn't really get anything done. But then as soon as I left to just go walk around, which felt like, wasted time compared to the rest of the day, I had all these ideas come to me, and sort of a lot of these roadblocks that I had run into with work, they seemed to clear as soon as I gave myself some mental space. It seems like that's something you've discovered as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, yeah, it is important to have these, whatever, how much time it is, but these moments, that, you're not focused on productivity or anything like that. And yeah, and sometimes, these are the moments which actually make you more productive in the end.
Right. Yeah. Well, great. Well, thank you very much, Katrin. And is there anywhere that people can reach out to or learn more about you and your work?
Absolutely. So, the easiest way really is to follow me on Twitter, and because that's where I usually share, the new work that is coming out, with everyone who's interested. And yeah, and also, obviously, if someone is interested, just, send me a direct message. Yeah.
Great. Well, fantastic. Well, thank you so much for your time.